Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm looking at a clip taken from a Frank Turek talk. It's in black and white, so you know it's serious. Also, before I ever did a video on Dr. Turek, I always thought that he was some heavy hitter for intelligent design. After my last Turek video, I thought, well, that was a response to a questioner, so it's understandable that he didn't have all of his facts straight off the top of his head. Maybe he was just talking out of his depth. After this one, I can't take him seriously anymore. This is directly from his presentation, and it looks like he misunderstands the fundamentals of evolution that I've never even seen such bottom-of-the-barrel creationists like Genesis apologetics get wrong. Well, on to the video.
Now, the second major area that evolutionists say point to macroevolution is similarities in structure, called homology.
Yes, homology is excellent evidence for evolution. And since Frank never gets around to it in this video, I will give a brief explanation here. If different species share a unique physical feature like a bone structure or a body plan, then these features are said to be homologous. This isn't as simple as just looking roughly similar. It's something that is complex and has an extremely small chance of evolving independently twice. The go-to example is the bone structure of the forelimbs of the vertebrates. All vertebrate forelimbs share the exact same bone structure with relatively minor variation. The different variations have been adapted to many different purposes, from swimming to flying to climbing to running and more. But they all share the same basic structure. Had they evolved separately, there would have been completely different structures performing the same function rather than identical ones with some variation, like wings. Yes, all vertebrate wings share the same basic bone structure, but wings have evolved independently outside of the vertebrates. Insect wings don't even have bones, but the selection pressure was there to develop flight, so flight developed. There is quite a bit more to homology and convergent evolution than this, and biologists don't just use visual similarities to determine whether or not two species' features are homologous, but I felt the need to give a basic explanation since Frank's video just glosses over it completely.
And DNA, that these are common evidences of a common ancestor. I should say these are evidences of a common ancestor. And we'll start with DNA first, and we'll go to our friend Richard Dawkins, author of The God Delusion, the most popular atheist in the world today.
My God, Frank, do you breathe when you talk? Now, I don't know how to best compare popularity between atheists, so I can't really verify that claim, but I mean, do you go by Twitter followers? Because Ricky Gervais has more than 10 million more Twitter followers than Dawkins. Gervais also has more than 100,000 more YouTube subscribers than Dawkins, and here I'm talking about the Richard Dawkins Foundation YouTube numbers, as Dawkins himself doesn't even have a channel. Gervais has 3.5 million more likes on his Facebook page than Dawkins. They're both atheists, but Ricky seems to be far more popular. And to completely invalidate this whole thing, I don't even know what's supposed to be so important about popularity. Why do you even bring up the subject of Dawkins' popularity? Are you about to read some quote from him and pretend that that speaks for every atheist in the world because he's the most popular? Well, I hate to break it to you, Frank, but unless you are quoting Dawkins in a peer-reviewed research journal, then whatever you're about to quote can at best be his opinion. Certainly his opinion carries more weight with me in some areas than other people's opinions, but he's also said plenty of things that I completely disagree with. But let's just wait and see what you're going to pull up.
Richard Dawkins was asked by Philip Johnson, the man who wrote the groundbreaking book about 20 years ago called Darwin on Trial.
The groundbreaking book on evolution written by a lawyer and described by evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould as a clumsy, repetitious, abstract argument with no weighing of evidence, no careful reading of literature on all sides, no full citation of sources, and occasional use of scientific literature only to score rhetorical points. Yes, I know, Gould is a biased evolutionist. Well, in the paragraph just before he railed on Darwin on Trial, he praised the 1971 anti-evolution book by Norman Macbeth called Darwin Retried as being much better written and actually bringing up some disturbing points, but ultimately failing because it used the legal requirement of guilt beyond any reasonable doubt, which is a standard that is rather the reverse of how science works. In a court of law, the court must reach a decision even if there is insufficient evidence. As a result, the reasonable doubt standard was established on the grounds that it's better to let a guilty person go free than to imprison an innocent person. In science, even when the evidence is overwhelming, scientists will still present with caution as if there is uncertainty when there really isn't, because in science we are constantly trying to prove the last guy wrong. So scientists hedge their bets so that when they are inevitably proven wrong on some point, they can point to their caution and say that they obviously weren't suggesting that their idea was the only possibility. In science, nothing would pass the reasonable doubt test, and that's the whole point. The scientist that finds the reasonable doubt in something and overturns the previously held consensus is the one who goes down in history. But the fact of the matter is that nobody has ever been able to find any reasonable doubt in the theory of evolution, and that's why it sticks around.
Johnson was an attorney at UCal Berkeley.
Did you misspeak there, or is that you giving Berkeley a silly little derogatory nickname like Hovind does with things like National Geographic?
Actually, there are 200 species of squirrels in the world, according to National Pornographic.
He wasn't a biologist.
Yes, he was an attorney, not a biologist. So clearly his work on a field of biology should be taken as the gospel truth. Now, far be it from me to say that a person has no right to comment on a field that they don't have expertise in. My whole channel is me doing just that, after all. But I wouldn't expect anyone to use me as a primary source for anything. That's why I list sources in the description of every single video. That's why I pin comments that point out where I make major mistakes. If you say you accept evolution and point to one of my videos as the reason, I will say go check out my sources. I'm not a biologist, yet I comment on biology. I'm not a geologist, yet I comment on geology. I am not a scientist, yet I comment on science. Because I defer to the scientific consensus. I know how the scientific community works and how it has built-in error-correcting mechanisms that weed out the bad ideas. If you're going to come along and write a book explaining why the foundational idea of modern biology is wrong, then you'd better either have expertise in the field or have significant backup in the scientific literature. Actually, even if you are an expert in the field, you still need to have significant backup in the literature. If you're the first to come across some glaring new piece of evidence, then your study needs to be replicated in order to confirm the results. No one book from a lawyer is going to destroy evolution.
But he pointed out that the problems with macroevolution are logical. They're not evidentiary.
In other words, despite the mountains and mountains of evidence in favor of evolution, he may have pointed out a couple times when scientists were wrong about it, or he may have quote-mined a few people saying dumb things about it, and it might have been enough in a court of law to say that there is reasonable doubt despite the evidence overwhelmingly being in favor of evolution. So in a court of law, that might fly. But in science, the mountains of evidence cannot be ignored. To quote Eugenie Scott's review of the same book, Johnson is applying his controversy-resolving skills to a non-controversy. That evolution occurred is, in science, if not the general public, no more controversial than that the Earth goes around the sun. Basically, from having read several reviews of this book, it didn't even come close to calling evolution into question. At best, it pointed out a few mistakes that were subsequently corrected.
We look at the evidence for macroevolution and then we have to make an interpretation.
An interpretation. And yes, the evidence is subject to interpretation, and more than a century of evidence has been interpreted as strongly supporting evolution by people who literally spend their entire lives looking at nothing but the evidence for evolution.
And he noticed that many of the philosophical assumptions and much of the reasoning processes that Darwinists were using to back up their theory were faulty.
Well, I'm not here to argue with a book that I never read, so give an example or move on.
So he wrote Dawkins and he said, hey, Dr. Dawkins, what's your best evidence for macroevolution? Just bottom line me, if you will.
Yeah, give a simple soundbite to explain the best evidence for a theory that has multiple excellent lines of evidence that has been gathered over the course of the last century and a half. If it can't be explained in a soundbite, it must be wrong.
And here's what Dawkins wrote back. The reason we know for certain that we are all related, including bacteria, is the universality of the genetic code and other biochemical fundamentals.
Sure, that is an excellent line of evidence. And it's a fairly recent one too, having just emerged within the last 50 years or so. It's an independent line of evidence that fully supports all of the lines of evidence that existed before genetics were even discovered.
What's he basically saying?
He's basically just giving an oversimplified soundbite that doesn't ultimately explain anything, which I'm sure you'll try to skew in one way or another.
He's saying, look, man, we all have DNA. And you've heard the story before, right? Depending on how you look at DNA similarity is about 96% between apes and humans, although that's controversial now.
It's not that it's controversial, it's that there are different ways of measuring similarity. For instance, gene duplication is a thing. There are places where humans have 2 identical copies of a gene, and chimps only have 1 copy of that same gene. Do we count that as one difference, or one difference per every extra base pair on the human side? What about when there is a gene that's identical in both chimps and humans, but appears in a different spot in the overall code? Is that one difference, or several? And what about the changes that occur as the result of these differences? Looking at a sentence as an analogy, a small change can completely change its meaning. I'd rather eat, Randy, would mean that rather than do whatever it is that Randy proposed, you'd like to eat. Well, I'd rather eat Randy means something completely different.
I'd rather eat Randy. I'd rather eat Randy.
So do you just count the little differences in the genetic sentence, or do we count the big difference in phenotypic expression? So it's not really a controversy because ultimately it doesn't matter what the percentage similarity is, but it's just not as simple as a letter-by-letter comparison. But the genetics do not lie. Chimps are our closest living relatives, with bonobos coming in a close second.
But it's also about 90% between mice and humans.
You say that as if it's a problem. Using the measurement methods that came up with the 96% ape and human, which I'd actually like you to specify which ape since it's not the same as we are more closely related to some than others, but using the same measurement standards that came up with that number, we would expect to see a number around the 90% mark for other mammals. These similarities are only a problem if you're trying to assert that humans were somehow specially created to be separate from the rest of the animal kingdom.
And the closer you get to humanity with apes or chimpanzees or primates,
You slipped a little there, Frank. You just tacitly admitted that going from mammals like mice to mammals like primates is going in the same direction as humans, which makes perfect sense if humans are indeed primates.
you appear to have DNA most similar to humanity. And this is supposed to show that we have a common ancestor.
Not supposed to show, does show. And if you want to argue for a designer that utilizes a common design, then it looks very much like the designer doesn't really know what he's doing and is just throwing mud at the wall to see what will stick. Which, coincidentally, is the same kind of design you would expect to see from unguided natural selection.
It's quite possible Dawkins is right. What does science tell us? Science tells us we have a common genetic code. What do we have to do as scientists? We have to take that data and interpret it and try and figure out what's the best explanation for why we have a common genetic code.
And the best explanation is that we share a common ancestor. If this were not the best explanation, then you would expect to see argument between the religious scientists and the non-religious scientists. But you don't. You see almost universal consensus from people who study this for a living agreeing that common ancestry is the best explanation, and a handful of creationists trying to make it look like it's a 50-50 shot between evolution and design. To quote Gould again, the great American botanist Asa Gray, who favored natural selection and wrote a book entitled Darwiniana, was a devout Christian. Move forward 50 years, Charles D. Walcott, discoverer of the Burgess shale fossils, was a convinced Darwinian and equally firm Christian who believed that God had ordained natural selection to construct a history of life according to his plans and purposes. Move on another 50 years to the two greatest evolutionists of our generation. G.G. Simpson was a humanist agnostic, Theodosius Dobzhansky a believing Russian Orthodox. Either half my colleagues are enormously stupid, or else the science of Darwinism is fully compatible with conventional religious belief and equally compatible with atheism, thus proving that the two great realms of nature's factuality and the source of human morality do not strongly overlap. So your religion need not conflict with evolution, and the people who share your religion and make their living studying biology agree that there need be no conflict. So please stop trying to paint this as an us versus them battle of worldviews when it is clearly not.
Is one possibility we have a common ancestor? Yeah, Dawkins could be right. What's the other possibility he's not even thinking of? Anyone? We have a common creator. DNA similarity could be evidence of a common designer or creator rather than a common ancestor. Similar structures often have a similar blueprint.
And like I said, that just goes to show a lack of forethought on the part of the creator. Why would he design us with defects that, from a purely genetic perspective, make it look like we belong in the same group as the rest of the primates? For instance, we have the gene for synthesizing vitamin C, but it's inactive, meaning that we have to get vitamin C from our diet. If some creator were just copy-pasting the genetic code from similar animals and modifying it to make our bodies just a little bit different, why would they leave in a part of the code that could be useful, think of how many scurvy-ridden sailors would have survived their long trips, but switch it off to make it useless? It's a gene that is present in all vertebrates except for teleost fish, which lost it completely, but a mutation caused it to be switched off for primates, guinea pigs, and some bats. And here's the kicker. The specific mutation that switched it off is different for every related group. It switched off in a different way for bats than for guinea pigs, and again in a different way for guinea pigs than for primates. And some bats that once had it switched off have regained the ability to synthesize vitamin C, but it's hypothesized that the gene is too mutated at this point to evolve towards reactivation in primates and guinea pigs, despite some success in reactivating it in a lab. All this to say that we have a gene that shows every sign of being an evolutionary leftover, which served a purpose that would have been useful to us, but which purpose was lost to us. So either we evolved from a common ancestor with the rest of the primates who lost the ability to synthesize vitamin C, or the creator who gave us our genetic code did a really sloppy job and mangled their own code in the process. To continue the programming language analogy, it looks like they accidentally deleted a closing bracket on part of the code during the copy-paste, causing it to stop functioning, and rather than debug it and fix it, they just commented out the whole section and left the remnants in. And our genetic code is filled with anomalies like this which make no sense if we were purposely put together by a creator who wanted us to be his penultimate creation.
Why? I mean, what would the evidence have to look like at the DNA level for Dawkins to say, well, we're not ancestrally related?
If it were designed perfectly, that would be a good hint. Or maybe the all-knowing, all-powerful creator of the universe could have had the rest of the animal kingdom operate on DNA, but have humanity operate on a completely different genetic system. God is supposed to be all-powerful. He could easily have created a second system, even one that's superior to DNA. That would make it abundantly clear that we did not evolve alongside the rest of the animals. But no, God couldn't be bothered to separate us so clearly from the other animals. He had to make it look like we were closely related to chimps for reasons.
Would the DNA have to be 50%? Would it have to be 25% similar?
0% would make it pretty obvious that we weren't related. And it would have been well within God's power to do, unless you don't think God is all-powerful.
I mean, it seems arbitrary to what he's saying here. We simply don't know.
No, we don't. But God should have. And if God really wanted us to believe that we aren't animals and aren't even related to the animals, then God could have designed us in a way that would make that abundantly clear. But he didn't. He designed us to look like we evolved. Now, assuming for argument's sake that your God exists, that means that he either set up evolution as a mechanism for diversifying life and gave us Genesis as a metaphor or allegory meant to teach us some sort of moral lesson, or he's a trickster God who wants to deceive us. Now, that might be a false dichotomy, though. Maybe God's lazy? Or incompetent? No matter how you slice it, though, I just cannot think of an option that makes your God look good.
But you know what? Dawkins has already ruled out the only other possibility from natural causes. What's the other possibility for a natural cause? Is an intelligent cause, right? A non-natural cause.
AKA magic. Yes, Dawkins did rule out magic.
Dawkins has philosophically ruled that out before he's even looked at the evidence, which means what?
Which means that the answer magic is useless to science. The answer evolution has led to scientific advances everywhere in biology. Had Darwin left it as must have been God, then he never would have published on the origin of species. Had everyone else also looked at the diversity of life and just decided that that's how God made it, we never would have found the genetic code. That answer stifles curiosity. And I know this is where Christians point to people like Mendel and say, well, he was a Catholic monk completely devoted to his religion, and he made an important scientific discovery. I would argue that he made his discoveries in spite of his religion, not because of it. He was curious. The answer, that's just the way God made it, didn't satisfy him, so he investigated to find out how God made it. What mechanisms did God use? Turns out he used mechanisms that appear to be completely natural in origin, nothing supernatural required. And this did not shake his faith. If you want to prop God up as the first cause for everything, then fine, be my guest. But when you are scared of things like evolution because you don't think that's how God did it, then you're putting limitations on your God. If God exists, he used evolution. If you don't like that fact, that's on you. Not on scientists, not on your God, on you. I say this all the time, but if God created nature, then a study of how nature works should not be threatening to those who believe in God.
The only conclusion he can come to is it's got to be a natural cause. Evolution must be true.
The religious scientists are facepalming at you right now. Evolution must be true because that's where the evidence points. Yeah, sure, it could be magic, but that's not a helpful answer. That answer leads us nowhere.
Again, this is a matter of interpreting the evidence. You know what? Similarity is not the problem for Darwinists. It seems to me that Darwinists must explain the vast dissimilarity between living things. The bee, the octopus, the Venus flytrap, mildew, the peacock, the porcupine, the human are all related according to Darwinists.
Yeah, they are. All those species are related to varying degrees. There was a book explaining how that works published quite a while ago. Something about how the different species originated, the origin of certain species. The theory of evolution by natural selection is itself the explanation for the diversity of life. The more dissimilar we are from a species, the further back in time our common ancestor with them existed. After we diverged from whatever other species you want to compare us to, our evolutionary history was different, producing massive differences. The fact that you're bringing up differences between organisms and suggesting that this is the really difficult thing for evolution to explain, shows your complete and utter lack of understanding of evolution, as explaining the differences is exactly what it's all about. See, the real question isn't why are we so similar to the rest of the apes, it's how did we become so different? What selection pressures led us to lose most of our hair? Why do we walk upright when our closest relatives mostly walk on all fours? Why did primates lose the ability to synthesize vitamin C, and why don't most of the rest of the vertebrates lose that ability? Evolution is all about finding explanation for differences like these and many others, and if you missed that very basic fact, then why should anyone trust anything else you have to say on the subject?
How did we get this great diversity of life without intelligence? Where did this come from?
Evolution by natural selection.
Do you know that you are supposed to be related to the mildew on your shower floor?
Yes, very, very distantly related. Your personal incredulity does not change that.
According to Darwinism. Do you know, and this isn't often talked about because Darwinists have no real idea of how this could occur, but we're related to plants too.
Are you kidding? We don't talk about it often, but we definitely do talk about it. You can buy a t-shirt, linked down below, making a joke about Kent Hovind's incredulity at the idea that pine trees don't produce elephants when R and Ra agreed that they are the same kind, eukaryote kind. It's not that we're afraid of it as being some ridiculous idea that will cause people to stop accepting evolution, it's that our common ancestor with plants was so far into the past that we are, rather obviously in my opinion, very significantly different from plants. So when we're talking about our relationship with other organisms, it doesn't usually come up. But it's not like anyone's hiding it. In fact, most of the very broad tree of life graphics that I've seen clearly show the relationship between animals and plants.
They never talk about plant evolution, but they think all life is the result of some natural process.
You say that as if plant evolution somehow demonstrates that life is not part of a natural process. Also, a Google Scholar search for plant evolution yielded 3.7 million results. Using the NCBI search engine, there were again results numbering in the millions for plant evolution spread across several databases. For myself, I often use plants, particularly strawberries, as an example of information being added to the genetic code, because some plants are very prone to polyploidy, where its entire genome is duplicated. So tell me again how we never talk about plant evolution?
Now, let me show you one other thing. Remember I just put this quote up here from Dawkins. Do you want to see the entire quote?
What's that? A creationist giving context to a quote? That's unheard of. But I won't go quite so far as to congratulate you on a job well done, because I know you're going to leave out the beginning of that quote, where Dawkins discusses the matter of seamless continuum of a distance of cousinship measured by resemblance, especially molecular resemblance. And even that is out of the context of their larger conversation, which I will link to down below. And as a special bonus, it's even hosted on a creationist website.
Look at this. The reason we know for certain we are all related, including bacteria, is the universality of genetic code and other biochemical fundamentals. Here's the remainder of the quote. My philosophical commitment to materialism and reductionism is true, but I would prefer to characterize it as a philosophical commitment to a real explanation as opposed to a complete lack of an explanation, which is what you espouse, talking to Philip Johnson again.
In other words, we look at the evidence and assume that the explanation is not magic. Because that's what the creationist view ends up at. A magical being somehow poofed us into existence. So instead of considering magic, scientists start with the assumption that nature works in natural ways. Ultimately, yes, it is impossible to prove that the supernatural does not exist, but that's only because of the completely unfalsifiable nature of the supernatural. Anything that we find in nature could be hand-waved away with the explanation, that's just how God did it, but this hand-waving explanation is ultimately not helpful in the advancement of science. So scientists, including religious ones, prefer to look for the natural explanations which actually do provide us with useful advancements in understanding.
In other words, Dawkins is admitting he is philosophically committed to naturalism. He's philosophically committed to only one possibility.
No, it's not that he's committed to one possibility, but that any possibilities must be naturalistically possible in order to be seriously considered. Nature is full of possibilities that have nothing to do with the question of the existence of the supernatural.
Notice the intelligent design people are saying it could be a natural cause. It could also be an intelligent cause.
And which hypothesis has more evidence backing it up? When we look at the mess that is our genome, does it look designed or like it evolved? The answer is clear to anyone who looks at it in an unbiased manner. It looks evolved.
Why don't we follow the evidence where it leads?
We have. Just because you don't like where the evidence led, doesn't mean we have to take your proposition seriously. That's it for this video. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Ansats66 on my video about Christian persecution, who says, "The anecdotes about being afraid of Christians really undermine the point of the video. Here we're trying to say that Christians aren't being persecuted, and yet we've got a story about being afraid of Christians. Apparently these Christians can't openly display their Christianity without suffering negative consequences from people who distrust Christians. Rhino didn't feel comfortable speaking openly around these Christians, and that's blatant religious discrimination. Is Rhino alone in having this attitude, or perhaps there's more discrimination against Christians than the video would like us to think?" To which I say, yeah, the people who have to hide part of who they are for fear of being treated differently are clearly the ones doing the persecuting. What negative consequences did these people suffer from my being concerned about their opinions about my atheism? Are the gay kids who are still in the closet persecuting their parents by not telling them for fear of being kicked out? Now, once again, I would like to point out that I do not think that the people I was hiding my atheism from would have treated me any differently had they known. Those were simply the events that made me think to make a video about it. The point was that it is not the people who can display religious symbols without fear of any backlash from anyone who are persecuted. It's the ones who are treated differently by their community simply because they don't have the same imaginary friend. And before anyone comments on this, watch the video for context. I am aware that I personally don't face persecution as an atheist, but I get plenty of communication from people who do. So thanks for watching. Remember to leave a comment, follow me on Twitter, and support me on Patreon. See you next time.